This move immediately claims central space and opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, preparing for rapid development. This move symmetrically mirrors white's central pawn advance, directly contesting the d4 square and opening lines for black's queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for many classic open game continuations. This move initiates one of the most classical and fundamental chess openings, developing a knight to control the central squares and prepare for castling. This develops a knight, controls central squares d4 and e5, and prepares for potential pawn advances like d5 or c6, leading into common opening structures like the Italian game or Raul Lopez. This move initiates the Raul Lopez, a fundamental opening that immediately challenges black's knight and prepares to develop pieces harmoniously while controlling the center. This move, the Morphy defense, is a standard response in the Raul Lopez, forcing white's bishop to either retreat or exchange, often leading to a more open game. This move maintains the Raul Lopez opening, keeping pressure on black's knight and preventing a potential pawn break with b5 by forcing black to address the bishop's presence. Black develops another piece, challenging white's e4 pawn and preparing to castle kingside, continuing the main line of the Raul Lopez opening. Castling kingside solidifies the king's position and connects the rooks, a fundamental development step in this Raul Lopez opening. This move challenges white's central pawn and attempts to gain material by exploiting the potential pin on the knight if white recaptures with the pawn, but it allows white to gain time and develop an attacking initiative. This move initiates a sharp tactical battle, aiming to exploit black's advanced knight and open lines for attacking play, typical of the main lines in the Raul Lopez exchange variation. This move, 6, b5, boldly challenges white's aggressively placed bishop, forcing it to retreat and gaining valuable tempo for black's queenside development, while also preparing to potentially free the c8 bishop. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, maintaining pressure on the center and preparing for potential future pawn breaks. This move, 7, d5, is a common and principled response in the Raul Lopez martial attack, directly challenging white's central control and opening lines for black's pieces. This capture opens the d-file for white's rook and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure by forcing an exchange, potentially creating weaknesses. This move develops the bishop to a square where it supports the central pawn and prepares to challenge white's control of the d5 square. This move solidifies the center and prepares to develop the queenside pieces by supporting the b4 square and reinforcing the d4 pawn. Developing the bishop to e7 reinforces the kingside defense and prepares to castle, solidifying black's position in this variation of the Raul Lopez. This developing move prepares to reinforce the knight on e4, supports the eventual advance of the c-pawn, and keeps options open for further piece coordination, all while staying true to standard Raul Lopez mainlines. This move, 10, nc5, repositions the knight from the somewhat passive e4 square to a more active central square, aiming to contest white's central pawn control and potentially threaten the bishop on b3. This move strategically repositions the bishop to a more flexible square, preparing to potentially support a central pawn push and offering defense to the kingside. This move boldly challenges white's center, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, a characteristic maneuver in many Raul Lopez variations seeking active counterplay. This move, 12, na4, sacrifices a pawn to open lines and gain central control, aiming to exploit black's slightly compromised pawn structure and potentially create attacking Opportunities against the king. This move initiates a tactical skirmish by offering a pawn to disrupt white's central control and open lines, aiming to exploit the current pawn structure in the center. This move, nxc5, aims to resolve the tension in the center and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure by capturing the knight that was occupying a critical central square. Black recaptures the pawn, opening the c-file for the rook and reinforcing control of the d4 square. This move, b4, repositions the bishop to a more active square where it eyes black's queenside pawns and supports a potential kingside attack, while also preparing to challenge the bishop on c5. This move develops the queen to a more active square, preparing to castle queenside and connecting the rooks once the queenside castling is completed. This move prepares to challenge black's control of the central light squares and potentially activate the queen on the c-file, aiming to disrupt black's development and central pawn structure. This move strategically centralizes the bishop, offering active play and creating attacking chances against white's pawn chain. This move recaptures the pawn, but crucially, it opens the b-file for black's rook and strengthens white's queenside pawn structure by creating an isolated pawn on c3, which may become a target later. This move brings the rook to the d-file, aiming to contest the open file and potentially support a future d3 push, while also creating defensive capabilities. This move activates the bishop, aiming to trade off black's well-placed knight on d5, which is currently disrupting white's pawn structure and controlling key squares. This move resolves black's central pawn tension and opens the d-file for the rook, while also developing the bishop to a more active square on the kingside. This recapture maintains central tension and repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing for potential queenside expansion while keeping an eye on the d-file. The knight's repositioning to e7 aims to prepare for central pawn breaks and reinforce the kingside, while also potentially eyeing a future sortie to g6. This exchange clears white's center pawns and aims to simplify into an endgame where their active pieces, particularly the queen, can exploit black's potentially compromised pawn structure and exposed king. This exchange on the e7 square aims to re-establish central pawn tension and avoid doubling white's pawns after a future recapture by the e-pawn. This move brings the queen into a very active position, targeting the weakened b7 square and potentially creating threats against black's king or valuable pieces. This move challenges white's queen, aiming to disrupt its attacking posture and potentially gain tempi while centralizing the queen. This move initiates a tactical sequence, forcing the opponent's king into a precarious position and aiming to exploit white's regained initiative after the earlier pawn structure complications. The move of the queen to d7, after the rook's move to d8 and the forced exchanges, aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, preparing to defend the e7 bishop and potentially support counterplay along the d-file or even along the 7th rank. White's capture recaptures material equality and simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the open a-file and potential weaknesses in black's queenside pawns. Black castles kingside, a crucial defensive maneuver to secure the king after the exchange on e4 and the subsequent development of pieces. This knight maneuver to d4 activates the piece, attacks the pawn on c6, and supports a potential kingside advance. This move aims to reposition the rook to an active file, contesting white's control and preparing to challenge the opponent's central pawn majority. The move 24, qc6, aims to force simplification by trading queens or winning material with the discovered attack on the rook. though black's defensive resources like c5 and bf5 must be carefully considered. This move centralizes the rook, contesting the open d-file and preparing for potential pawn breaks or exchanges that could open lines for white's queen and knight. This move initiates pressure on the queenside by placing the rook on the open b-file, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure and coordinate with the knight for an attack. This move repositions the queen to a central square, eyeing potential checks on the kingside and offering defensive support to the knight on d4, while also preparing for future pawn advances or piece exchanges. The exchange of queens simplifies the position and enters an endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside become a significant strategic advantage. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where black aims to leverage their more active rook on the d-file against white's potentially weak pawns. The knight advances to c6, blockading the advanced d-pawn and preparing to potentially fork the king and rook on the d-file or occupy a strong outpost. The rook re-engages on the open e-file, preparing to contest this crucial central avenue and support potential pawn advances later in the endgame. This move aggressively challenges black's central pawn, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure and potentially gain control of the queenside open files. This move is a critical decision to contest the open c-file, aiming to prevent white's rook from dominating it and potentially creating a passed pawn. This move captures the pawn on b5, aiming to exploit black's weakened queenside pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn, while also relieving pressure on white's d4 pawn. This pawn thrust to g5 is a bold attempt to create counterplay and disrupt white's queenside space advantage, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially target the vulnerable f2 square. This move prepares to create a passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the a-pawn, which aims to restrict black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create a tactical advantage. This move actively attacks white's knight on c6, aiming to disrupt its central control and potentially open lines for black's rook on the second rank. This knight check forces the black king to move, simplifying the position and allowing white to exploit the weakened pawn structure on the kingside. After the exchange, this recapture simplifies the position, eliminating white's active knight and creating a more favorable endgame structure for black due to the connected passed pawns on the queenside. This pawn push advances the queenside majority, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt black's coordination on the queenside. This move seeks to activate the rook on the 7th rank, creating potential threats to white's pawns and piece structure while also preparing to contest the open c-file. This pawn advance on b6 creates a protected passed pawn, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially break through on the queenside. This move is a strategic concession, allowing white to establish a dangerous passed pawn on b6 and initiate a decisive pawn race with the rook actively involved. This pawn capture opens the a-file for the rook, aiming to create decisive pressure against black's kingside or advance the passed b-pawn. This move prepares to challenge white's dominant rook on the b-file by reinforcing the c8 square, aiming to improve black's rook activity and potentially contest the open file later. The move b7 creates a protected passed pawn, aiming to advance further and potentially promote, forcing black to dedicate significant material to stopping its progress. This rook sacrifice is a critical moment to expose the weakness of white's passed pawn, aiming to create counterplay by clearing the b-file for your own rook and potentially opening lines against the white king. The rook transfer to the 8th rank aims to contest the open file and potentially pressure black's weak b-pawn, creating dynamic counterplay. This move appears to be a slight inaccuracy. Bringing the rook back to the e-file now allows white to consolidate after recapturing the pawn. And black should instead focus on challenging white's passed b-pawn with moves like rc8. This rook exchange simplifies the position, transitioning into an endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside, supported by the king, aim to become decisive. This rook sacrifice on the exchange offers a crucial tempo to promote white's passed pawn, which is now poised to become a queen. This pawn move aims to create an escape square for the king on g2 and prepare for potential kingside pawn advances, although it does weaken the kingside pawn structure by creating a backward pawn on f4. This king move is a practical decision to centralize and activate the monarch as the endgame. Transitions. Preparing to support the pawn majority on the kingside and potentially participate in the defense of the queenside pawns. The king moves to a safer central square, preparing for potential pawn advances or to support the d-pawn should it become necessary to advance it in the endgame. Black initiates a pawn storm on the kingside to create active counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated position and potentially open lines for the king or pieces. The pawn exchange on h5 opens up the g-file for white's rook and creates a passed pawn. But it also weakens white's king safety and could lead to tactical complications. The king's advance to h6 seeks to activate the monarch and prepare for a potential fight on the kingside as the material simplifies. But it also exposes it to potential checks along the light squares if white can exploit the open g-file. This check forces the black king to a more exposed position, which is crucial in this rook endgame where both sides have advanced pawns and the king's safety is paramount for pawn promotion. The black king, having emerged from its castled position to capture material, now finds itself exposed to a dangerous perpetual check due to the white rook's controlling presence on the 7th rank. The king advances to a more central square, activating it for the endgame and potentially supporting the advance of the h-pawn. This rook-pawn push aims to secure the king and potentially prepare a queenside counterplay. But it weakens the pawn chain and exposes the king to further attacks down the g-file. This move solidifies the kingside pawn structure, preparing to defend against black's potential pawn advances and aiming to restrict the king's exposure. The move 43, kg6 aims to bring the king closer to the center to support the remaining pawns and prepare for potential endgame scenarios, while avoiding being trapped by white's active pieces. The king is actively participating in the endgame, seeking safety and potentially supporting pawn advances. This move repositions the black king, aiming to centralize it and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the f-file opposition. The white king is actively advancing to support the potential passed pawn on the kingside and prepare for the endgame consolidation. With the rook endgame featuring kings and pawns now established, black's king must actively participate to support its remaining pawns and contest the central squares. This pawn move aims to create kingside space and potentially prepare for further pawn advances or to provide an escape square for the king. This move intends to redeploy the king to a more active central position, aiming to participate in the endgame by supporting potential pawn advances and controlling key squares against white's king. This move simplifies the position by exchanging kings and pawns, aiming to utilize the active king in the endgame to support the passed pawn on the a-file. This move brings the king to a more active central square, aiming to support the remaining pawns and potentially create counterplay in the endgame. This move reactivates the rook to pressure the opponent's pawns and prepare for potential pawn breakthroughs on the queenside. This check forces the white king to a more vulnerable square, allowing black to potentially activate its remaining pieces and create attacking chances. White captures the pawn, simplifying the endgame and centralizing the king to further support the passed b-pawn. Black's move is a defensive maneuver aiming to protect the vulnerable king by moving it away from the active rook and potential checks along the third rank. This pawn advance aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside by clearing the f-file, which is crucial for creating endgame winning chances given the opponent's king activity. This move injects the opponent's king into a dangerous, centralized position, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create tactical weaknesses around the exposed monarch, though care must be taken not to overextend. This move aims to reposition the king to a safer central square, allowing it to participate in the defense of the kingside pawn majority while preparing to escort the king to the queenside. This check is a tempo-gaining move, forcing the white king to move again and allowing black to regroup their pieces after the exchange. On f8, the king is now actively participating in the endgame, seeking safety and coordination with the remaining pawns to escort them to promotion. This check forces white's king to move, preventing immediate checkmate threats and potentially creating a safer square for the king to regroup from the exposed central position. This move aims to secure the king and prepare for potential pawn advances or exchanges in the center, a crucial step in a simplified endgame. The king's perilous journey to the center of the board is a critical endgame strategy, seeking active participation and potential pawn support. The rook's move to b4 is a solidifying maneuver, aiming to protect the vulnerable b-pawn from further attack while preparing to support a potential advance on the kingside or re-engage in the center if necessary. The rook on h8 aims to support the advancement of the king and potentially create complications, though white's rook on b4 is well placed to contest the d-file and prevent significant incursions. This move initiates a pawn race by advancing the f-pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn on the kingside to distract black's king and potentially win the g-pawn. This move sacrifices the rook to create a passed pawn on the kingside, hoping to disrupt white's control and potentially create counterplay. This move aims to create a dangerous passed pawn on the 6th rank, which will put black's king in a precarious position and force concessions. The rook check forces the king to a more vulnerable square, aiming to break through the pawn shield and disrupt white's defensive setup. White's king finds a safe haven on e7, repositioning to support the upcoming f-pawn push and prepare for potential pawn races on the kingside. This check forces the white king to a less secure square, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and potentially create attacking opportunities for black's remaining pieces. The move 58, kf8 seeks to consolidate the king's position on a safer square while preparing to support the passed f-pawn, a crucial element for potential promotion. Black initiates a final attempt to create counterplay by activating their rook to the 7th rank, aiming to pressure white's king and potentially create a passed pawn or disrupt white's coordination. This move is a clear attempt to promote the pawn, as the king is in a position to support it and it is the only remaining pawn for white. This move aims to consolidate the rook's position on the f-file, creating potential threats against white's king and preparing to defend against white's passed pawn on the b-file. This move activates the rook to a central file, threatening to infiltrate black's position and support a potential pawn push or king attack.